everybody, and welcome to week 2 of the Captain's Run. I know that you've had a fantastic week with your coaches and all of your groups, and now we get a chance to hear from Gavin Ford about what our topic is this week.
What's been the impact of COVID-19 on conservation in Africa? I'm going to answer this the other way around, because I think it gives you a much better insight into the depth of the disaster that's unfolding before us. So I'm afraid it's not always good news this morning. It's not good news. All right, so conservation essentially is one of those almost a moral ethic that many of us follow. But nothing pays for ethics. Ethics is something that you have inside you, and it's the way you're brought up, the way you think, etc., etc. And so when you take that idea and you've got to do things with that, especially on a macro scale, it's got to be paid for, all right? And conservation NGOs the world over are generally funded by individuals. You and me, the guy standing in the street corner with a tin, it's a voluntary submission of money, donation of money. So essentially it's disposable income, if you want to, if we dress it up a bit. With the impact that COVID has had on businesses, tourism, international travel and local travel, the tourist money that was brought in as a result of business into safari camps, hotels, lodges, anything to do with tourism, bungee jumping over the falls, a small percentage of all that money has been bled off over time and legitimately into various conservation bodies. So what's happened and the worst impact has been the cutting off of international travel. All right. So a lot of people would still want to be here watching our wildlife, and they're not concerned about the COVID side, but they can't travel. So there's been a complete severe severance of all funds coming into Africa. Think about that. That's impacted businesses. You all know that. It's impacted individuals. It's impacted the NGOs. It's impacted governments and government departments. And of course, one of the first things that are the first casualties of this whole thing are non-essential facets of life, okay? And unfortunately, conservation is one of those. The other really strong negative, which is another tragedy to our lives, is the lack of money spreads poverty. And that's across the board. And the impact on this, and I'm going to just use South Africa as an example because you're all more familiar with that. The estimates are that it's going to drop the GDP by 6% of this country. Now, we don't know how long it's going to take for the country to recover, but I can tell you that the losses are estimated at over 3.8 billion rand, and a further 1.4 billion or 1.4 to 1.7 billion in bookings lost for the rest of this year. That's a lot of money. All right. I don't know what it is in dollars relative to Britain and all the rest of it, but in South Africa, Southern Africa as well, and in Zimbabwe, the figures are not as accurate, but the impact is of the same scale. So essentially, the agencies that protect conservation areas, be they national parks, be they Wim Jan, who's got a game farm outside Warm Baths, or Morimoli up in the northern area, or the guys down in the Savi Conservancy in Zimbabwe. The money has been cut off. Now, with the issues that we've had with conservation, and I'm not going to dwell on them, but you're all aware of the rhino issues, pangolins being collected and poached, lions being taken out for their bones, etc., donkeys, skins. I mean, it's endless. And I have to tell you that most of this, 98% of the incentive for poaching is driven by Asia, the Far East, namely China, Cambodia, Thailand, up there. The effect, therefore, is drastic. The scale of this impact is beyond measure at this stage, because the ramifications have spread right through all of our societies. And the worrying thing is we don't know when it's going to recover. Now, there are a number of species that rely totally on human protection, all right? And once that's gone, they're wide open and everything is vulnerable. So it's not a great picture, I'm afraid. Now, last week I talked about conservation issues having to have government cooperation. Okay. With the greatest will in the world, any government who wants to do it but doesn't have the money is not going to do anything. The NGOs are in exactly the same position. And the game ranch manager is in exactly the same position. You know, to run anti-poaching teams, which now need really super tech surveillance equipment, surveillance networks, you know, with neighboring properties, that all costs money. And the guys will put money into it up to a certain point, and then those funds start drying up. So the impact of COVID-19, that tiny little virus, is quite profound on conservation across the board. You know, you can have guys out on the ground, boots on the ground, doing research, which is non-combatant. You can have the anti-poaching teams, you can have the rangers just doing their jobs. Everybody will work for free for a while. And then the hard reality is you need to feed your family. You know, for all of us, our families are priority. And that's going to be the crunch. So that's going to be the crunch. So it's not good news, guys. And so that's the problem. It's on a scale that's unprecedented in the world. There are a few countries that are opening up, like Tanzania, parts of Zambia. In Zimbabwe, the guys are allowed to go back to the hunting industry, which is great. But you know what? America is the biggest market source of revenue for probably most of the tourism incentives around Africa anyway. Europe to a large extent as well, behind America. But you know what? You can't travel. And so, I mean, you can't leave America at the moment. And some of these countries, you can't enter them. So even if you could get out of America, you can't come into them. So it's a catch-22, unfortunately. So my take on it, and I'm jumping ahead of the situation at the moment, is that those of you guys who are into conservation and who would like to take an interest in it, you can do so, obviously, on a much more local scale. So all is not lost. So having just said it's all bad news, on a much more colloquial scale, you fellas can still contribute an awful lot to creating awarenesses and helping catch the ball.
When I look at how the COVID-19 crisis has affected economics globally. I mean, are we then hoping that once the markets start to reopen, that we'll suddenly see an influx of people and then a flooding of money into the economies of those places? Or do you think it will just be a sort of slow trickle in? What do you think might happen?
Okay, well, look, I'm a partner in a tour operating business. We've been operating for 10 years. America is our client base. Excuse me. And I can tell you that the majority of inbound operators, we call ourselves inbound. So people coming from out of Africa, coming into Africa, it doesn't matter where, but we say that we're inbound operators. The business demand for next year is almost overwhelming. So that's a positive at the end of the tunnel, but it's still a fairly long tunnel. We're only in June, you know. Business, we're hoping that things will clear by the end of September. And I know government recently issued a communique that said there wouldn't be tourism until February or January next year. Well, I know there's a massive movement taking place as we speak to reproach that individual who actually stated that, first of all, because he had no place to do that. And secondly, to be much more realistic. You know, we've already gone from level 5, 4, we're in 3. The chances are really, really good that by September, people will be traveling again. And so we can expect a trickle possibly towards the end of this year. And that may not be too late. You know, guys can hang on to a certain extent, but certainly next year, we are going to be overwhelmed. I mean, the camps, trying to get space in camps as we speak is very, very difficult. And that's just, we're a very small company. And when we extrapolate that to the larger operators like Wilderness and Beyond and Mercato and all these beggars, we can only hope that it's on the same scale as that. So it's essentially this year. But what we do know is that the enemy, and I'll use that word deliberately, the enemy are using this time to recruit people, ex-staff members, people from the communities, people from towns with contacts who have knowledge of these target areas. That's quite scary. And the money source that comes with those incentives, with those illicit offers, the money source is massive. So it's a tricky one.
No, I agree with you. And I guess this is one of those things.
Through this this pandemic, I'd like to ask the question. We have a large species, you know, groups of animals that need protecting. Through this, have you heard of any of the animals being poached? And has the poaching gone up or down, or has it stayed the same through this COVID?
Bruce, at the moment, the reports coming back are that they're expecting the whole impetus to suddenly increase like a wave. But at the moment, you see those enforcement agencies are still in the field. So long term, we're expecting a massive increase in incursions, to use it.
Yeah. Well, may I just go on there?
Sure.
When you said that the protectors, they can protect for so long until they need to feed their families, and they're not getting the funds through, that is when possibly the wave will actually hit. Because if they move, then the species are going to be unprotected.
Yeah.
And am I reading that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, the areas that are going to be hardest hit will obviously be those that are less able to protect their areas. So let's talk about the game ranching industry, which is very strong in this part of the world.
Mhm.
You know, there's guys there whose income essentially is wildlife. Okay, they breed animals, they sell them, they hunt them, they watch them. So it's completely wildlife orientated. So a lot of these fellows have got reserves, obviously, and they'll keep the fire burning. But if it's an extended period of isolation, their funds start running around and running out rather. And even I think what's going to happen is that you're going to get more and more cooperative means of protection for areas. So conservancies is an old term that we've used for guys getting together. I think it's going to force a lot of neighbors into that situation where they can pool resources up to a point and extend that period where they can keep boots on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, no.
Well,
Thanks, Gavin. It's got two questions. You said there were some the animals that rely 100% on humans looking after them. Can you just list those, who they are? And also,
Okay.
with the international travel not being an option at the moment, I would imagine that you guys, the tour operators and that would be looking locally. And are there sort of plans afoot to try and get that local sort of market more re-engaged? Because, you know, certainly in Zimbabwe, we have a sort of two-tier system where we have international sort of prices and you have, you know, local prices. And you know, I don't know if that's something.
Yeah. Gary, the animals that what I'm talking about, I was referring to there, are areas like breeding centers with huge paddocks, all right? So rhino in particular, which have been put into big paddocks to facilitate breeding, etc., especially up in Kenya. Those areas which are so large and animals that need big areas to breed, all right, those are areas that are opening up more and more, or becoming more and more vulnerable. There's a much greater use of technology, and I think that's the way forward for the future in many of these conservation zones. I'll call that a conservation zone. There are species of birds that rely on areas being isolated, okay? And I'll use an example, and it's not a good one, but you'll get the idea. There's certain bird species that breed on the coast in South Africa and up in Madagascar. And those beaches are protected full time to stop people going in there. And I'm talking in Madagascar, you know, we have bird species there which are down to their 30s and 40s in numbers. I mean, that's how bad it is. So those areas get opened up. Those birds can go, they can be gone in a couple of weeks, wiped out. So magnify that to some of the areas. I'm trying to think of a better one. Can't think of it off the top of my head. But anyway, so areas that should be protected. Okay, the abalone beds off Cape Point, down in the Cape. Okay, the syndicates that are working those areas are incredibly sophisticated. Now, nature conservation Cape area is very thin on the ground anyway. And if they pull what few resources they've got out there in the water, those syndicates are going to clean those areas. I mean, they pulled 2.5 tons the other day, 2.5 tons of abalone. That's a local example on a different scale.
That's incredible and I mean pretty frightening. And you know, when you think of the sort of stuff that we need to work on, that it really starts making you realize just how tough things are. I'm going to hand over to Ryan with his question.
Sorry, Gary, did that come towards answering your question?
The thumbs up says it all.
Okay.
Okay, Ryan, go for it.
I just wanted to ask, what is, you know, in terms of Southern Africa and stuff like that, you know, are there any kind of figures and stuff like that that you know off the top of your head of any funding and stuff like that that's coming in for these conservation programs? And also, you know, what are your primary and secondary sources of funding for conservation?
I don't have figures in the top of my head, I'm afraid, but I can tell you that the conservation funding as it stands at the moment is coming from people who have been have been approached sensibly by professional organizations, and they have been willing, they've got a reasonable amount of disposable income, and they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and they are then putting money into certain programs where there's definite accountability. Ivan, I'm going to use him as an example. Ivan has a lot of really good contacts in the States. He went about it by forming a very formal conservation NGO, okay, the Ivan Carter Wildlife Alliance, I think it is, or Conservation Alliance. So Ivan has been able to, he's got a board that makes him accountable to what goes on. And so people have been funneling money into his organization for disbursement to projects. And people are invited to visit the project so they can see where their money is going, where it's supposed to be. So I'm just using that as an example. There are going to be others around the world, but I can tell you the major ones like WWF that people are familiar with are going to be in trouble pretty soon. The African Wildlife Foundation as well. They don't have huge reserves. You know, none of these organizations build up massive reserves. It's just not on the nature of the beast. So to answer your question, I can almost with a degree of certainty tell you that very little government funding is coming in, and it doesn't matter what country you're in. So the funding is going to be private and on a big scale, but then again on a local scale, like the neighborhood, that's going to be drying up until people start to have salaries coming in, etc., etc. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. You did kind of answer it in a way, because another thing that I wanted to ask was, you know, what part are the government actually playing in terms of funding, and, you know, on how big of a scale are they actually, you know, affecting the systems and stuff like that in a negative or positive way?
Well, you know, they conservation as a whole, national parks, first of all, let's just, you deal with a formal body with that responsibility and mandate. National parks don't have a huge budget, and they never have. And so although they've had minor changes in policies to facilitate extra money coming in, it still gets dispersed by central government. So government is going to continue in the status quo, just keeping their departments going. But within those departments, the funding for extra activities, might be there, but it's not going to be extensive by any means.
And I guess that's the problem with how some of these things work, is the sense of the trickle down. You know, it comes in at the top and it's supposed to filter its way through to the organizations that need it.
Oh, we can hear you. We got you.
I was waving to someone, but I'm also had a question anyway. Yeah, firstly, thanks for your time. Secondly, I was just wondering, out of interest as well, internationally, you talked about Asia being 98% of the smuggling. Are you basically saying that the Asian governments, are they involved behind the scenes, or you're not allowed to talk about that? Or because you would think that they, being powerful governments like the Chinese, that the government would get very much more involved in trying to slow down international smuggling. That's the first part of the question. And second part of the question is, has it actually increased over the last few years, or is it actually coming down?
No, it's increased. Okay, first of all, you have to look at the cultural perception, which we're told. I've never been to China, and I'm going to use China because China's got over, I don't know how many billion people living there.
Yeah.
Billion. I mean, that's a lot. the cultural perception, we're told, and I'm told this by guys who've lived there, is that Africa is an unending source. And a lot of them don't even know where Africa is. So it's just whatever product lands in the marketplace for the average Joe on the street, he just knows he can go to this, and I'll use the term apothecary, and he's going to be able to buy rhino horn, pangolin scales, zebra hair, lion's teeth, lion's bones, lion's soup, whatever. He don't give a rat's ass where it comes from, because it's just a commodity. The government's view on it is that they've publicly said, oh, no, all this trade is now illegal, it's disallowed. But there's no active steps being taken to reduce it. And in Chinese culture, well, it's not just Chinese culture, human nature, I suppose, the rarer the product, the more
Sourced.
you want it and the more you're going to pay for it. Now, we're told that the price of rhino horn has actually decreased. But the guys are, there's syndicates working regardless of that, because they want to drive the price back up again, because they see that the rhino populations are going to decline to a point where there's not many left, certainly unprotected. And that will then drive the price back up again, even if it's an underground market. So Asia is the market, the prime market for the stuff that we're seeing happening up and down Africa at the moment. The bushmeat trade, which is another aspect, is driven by the need for the need and the desire for proteins. Okay, meat proteins. Africa is an insatiable pit for meat proteins. I mean, we could never produce enough meat to satisfy everybody. The issue with Africa is the bushmeat trade is worth millions of dollars. And up in Central Africa, what we're seeing, if you go to any of the markets from Entebbe northwards into the village markets there, you'll see crocodiles, pythons, every form of primate, chimpanzees, gorillas, every form of four-legged herbivore in the markets for sale. So we've just sort of mentioned the poaching side, which is the commercial side. The non-commercial side of poaching is the subsistence poaching level. All right. So guys who are trying to feed their families, you know what? We all get it. We understand that. You know, feeding your family on an impala or a dike or whatever, you'll do it. I mean, we'd all do the same thing. But the big commercial poaching of meat is what's not sustainable, and that's what's on the increase. Now, Tanzania, Kenya share the migration, which you've all heard about, I'm sure. The migration moves according to what rainfall there is, because it's driven by food and by grass association, grass growing, all right, the new grass. Often the rains fall outside the boundaries of the conservation areas and the parks. So you've got thousands and thousands of wildebeest and zebra primarily moving through those areas. At one time, the illicit harvest was over 55,000 animals per annum. Bushmeat.
Really? Yep.
Bushmeat trade. That's not sustainable. That's just an example of that.
I think that's quite a frightening one, but I suppose, you know, it's one of the avenues that we need to tackle. So I'm gonna let Hilton ask one more question here.
With regards to obviously what's happening with South African Airways at the moment, the troubles that they're going through, and South Africa being probably the main hub in Southern Africa, where, you know, a lot of our overseas tourists are coming from, landing in South Africa and then from South Africa going all over. Do you think the situation that South Africa is in is going to affect those numbers that you were talking about in terms of our tourists coming in from next year?
Hilton, are you asking me whether SAA going down the tubes is going to be a bad thing?
Yeah.
Okay. look, it would be terribly, terribly sad if SAA does go down the tube. And I hear the government's talking about launching another airline.
Yeah.
I mean, please. You know, Johannesburg hosts probably the most intercontinental airlines of any country in Africa. So if SAA does go down the tubes, no, I don't think it'll affect our numbers that much. It'll be very sad.
Yeah,
but
because I look at
you know,
the reason why I ask is because my mom works for South African Airways here in Zimbabwe. I look at the numbers that South African Airways are, well, before everything happened, the numbers that they were bringing into Vic Falls. I mean, they went from having 1 flight a day to like 3 flights a day, because there's so many tourists coming in to go into the Victoria Falls. But obviously that's going to change now, because if they aren't flying, I mean, Air Zimbabwe isn't doing a great job at the moment in terms of flights. So if you look at that Victoria Falls region on the Zimbabwean side, we could be in a bit of trouble with tourists coming in. So that's why I just wanted to find out if that would affect.
No, you know what? People will always find an alternative.
A way, yeah.
Get there, and so something gets removed from the system. Somebody else steps up into the plate. People will fly. If they want to get there, they'll get there.
Yeah.
You know, Delta Airlines in the States was a big one, coming in here every day at 5 o'clock. KLM, Lufthansa, Singapore, Qatar. There's a lot of airways out there. And you know, at the moment, Emirates is still flying, and so is Ethiopian.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much, Gavin.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I just back to like the wet markets and stuff. You know, it's pretty scary. We watched a thing here on 60 Minutes, and someone into China, into Wuhan, to see the wet markets and what, you know. We've heard so many conspiracy theories about the whole COVID-19 and how it started, but if something like that, you know, started, if it was, you know, through the animals and all that and what they're doing there, like, and it's brought the world to such a standstill, you'd think, how do the governments of, you know, like the US and something as big as that, like, how do they not get more involved, I think, or put more kind of sanctions on China, or you think, because it's like, because it brought the world to a standstill, then we've got all these other issues that are just such knock-on effects. It just makes you think, why don't these guys do something more, you know? Because if this could no doubt happen again, you know, if they don't get to the bottom of it, and if that is the actual cause.
Cora, it's a, you know what, this is a big deal. This is a big issue. Certainly, I don't know what the truth is, because we don't always get fed the truth from over the news channels, which we all are aware of. But I know there's a move afoot to make China accountable for this whole thing. But how successful that's going to be, I don't know. And China has such a foothold in the world now. And you know what? Every country in Africa has a major Chinese component now. And this has been happening over the last 20 odd years. I traveled to 13 different countries in Africa on safaris. Everywhere I go, and there's 54 countries in Africa, and everywhere I go, and those few, I see a Chinese contingent. I don't see there's any reason why there shouldn't be Chinese elsewhere on the continent.
Yeah.
So this is not something that's going to go away, and I don't know how successful anybody would be to make China accountable in the full sense. I really don't.
Yeah. No, it's such a
I'm
tough
sorry,
one. Yeah, I agree.
I only heard the last part of your question because your signal was really bad. Was that the essence of your question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I think I was just venting a bit, but yeah, no, definitely answered it. Thanks, Gavin.
Okay. It's quite interesting. If I can just add something here. You know, we call this phenomenon where animals are involved in passing on a virus to humans, we call those zoonotics. And it's happened several times.
Yeah.
You know, Ebola is thought to have evolved from human primate interaction because chimps and gorillas are eaten regularly up in Central and West Africa. The SARS virus was thought to have come from birds somewhere along the line, you know, through chickens. And now this virus, this coronavirus thing, is thought to have come from fruit bats. Well, hold me back. I don't know how that comes about. I've done a lot of work with bats and things, but anyway, that's what we're told. And we're also seeing in the news, the conservation news, the theory that pangolins now are being muted as animals that carry diseases. And now, whether or not this is fact or fiction, I have no idea. But all I can say is that if it is being pumped in the Far East, hallelujah, because that might just save a few pangolins' lives in our part of the world. Anyway.
Yeah, that's what I've thought too. I thought that's one good thing.
If there's one thing to come from all of this, perhaps from your point, Gavin, maybe we need to all stock up on pink slippers and start changing our dietary habits. I want to thank Gavin so much for all of the wisdom that you shared with us today. And
Thanks,
I think the discussion has just been so good. So I know that in the previous Captain's Run, you might have done this as well, but I also want to do a little bit of a clap for all of the first responders and for people who are working on the conservation lines and the front lines there. So if you can just do a little clap for all of them for, 5 to 10 seconds.
Well done, guys, on the front.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah,
Thank you so
great
much.
job, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Our wildlife needs help. Tourism to Africa is at an all-time low. You can assist by liking and sharing the conservation games. You can contribute financially by hitting the donate button on the Zambezia.com website. Let's get together and back up the frontline conservation team.